twilight of January 11, 1942, did not merely bring with it the biting cold that descended from the Arctic. It carried a long, lethal shadow stretching over 3,000 miles of ocean, from the captured port of Lorient, in occupied France, to the unsuspecting shores of a nation still slumbering in a dream of peace. The U-boat bunker at Lorient, a colossal, brutish cathedral of reinforced concrete built by the organization TOT, was a world unto itself, a monument to the Nazi war machine's industrial might and sinister ambition. Its vast, echoing interior, shrouded in perpetual damp semi-darkness, was a hive of frantic activity. The sounds were a deafening symphony of war. The high-pitched whine of electric winches, the clanging of metal on metal as torpedo-loading cranes swung their deadly cargo, the guttural shouts of chief petty officers and the low, pervasive thrum of idling diesel engines that vibrated through the very concrete underfoot. The air was a thick, palpable miasma, a cocktail of diesel fuel that coated the back of the throat, the sharp tang of brine from the open sea, the smell of wet, oil-slicked steel, the ozone crackle from electrical switchboards, and the coiled spring tension of men poised on the razor's edge of history, their faces a mixture of youthful bravado and the grim acceptance of veterans who knew the statistical unlikelihood of their return. On the black, oil-slicked water within the cavernous Pen D rested a sinister, almost prehistoric form, U-23, a Type 1C submarine of the Kriegsmarine. At 1,120 tons submerged and 251 feet long, it was one of Donitz's long-range oceanic cruisers, a vessel designed not for the cramped confines of the North Sea, but for the vast, lonely reaches of the global shipping lanes. Its design was a study in functional menace, a streamlined, hydrodynamic form punctuated by the squat tower of the conning tower, from which sprouted the periscopes, attack computer, and a bristling array of anti-aircraft weaponry. Its skin was a patchwork of welded steel plates, bearing the scars of depth charge attacks and the relentless corrosion of the sea. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Teddy Hardigan, a young man of 29 with a face weathered by the North Atlantic and the eyes of a relentless calculator, stood on the conning tower, a solitary figure amidst the controlled chaos. His gaze, cold and analytical, swept over the final, meticulous loading of provisions, canned meats, hardtack, sacks of dried peas, and the precious lemons to stave off the scourge of scurvy that could cripple a crew as effectively as enemy action. Then his eyes fell on the last of the G7E electric torpedoes, the temperamental eels being carefully winched down through the forward hatch. These were complex weapons, prone to running too deep, suffering from magnetic influence pistol failures, or simply becoming erratic circle runners that could turn back on the boat that fired them. They were the teeth of the wolf, and their reliability was a constant nagging worry. The crew, a mix of grizzled veterans with salt and pepper beards and wide-eyed youngsters on their first war patrol, moved with a practiced, almost ritualistic efficiency. Each man, from the chief engineer to the youngest mess attendant, was acutely aware that this mission was different. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a sense of historic import. They were not headed for the known killing grounds of the North Atlantic, the steel cemeteries where Allied convoys and Donitz's grey wolves had been locked in a deadly draining dance of attrition for years. The order, sealed in a waterproof envelope and carried next to Hardigan's heart, was clear, audacious, and laden with the weight of a potential strategic masterstroke that could alter the course of the war. Steer west, head for a coastline that still blazed with the lights of peacetime, a nation that still clung to the childlike illusion of invulnerability granted by two vast oceans. Operation Paukenschlag, the drumbeat, was about to commence. What no one strolling the illuminated boardwalks of Atlantic City, no one dancing in the glittering ballrooms of New York, no one fishing off the tranquil piers of Florida could possibly fathom was that the drum roll of war would not come from the skies or from distant trenches, but from the abyssal silence just beyond the horizon. The drum they would hear would not be made of skin and wood, but of compressed air and steel, and its sound would be the muffled, catastrophic thunder of a German torpedo tearing open the hull of an American ship, a sound that would echo through the very foundations of a nation's confidence. The strategic genesis of Paukenschlag was the singular brainchild of Admiral Karl Dönitz, the austere, brilliant, and utterly dedicated master of submarine warfare. A man who had personally commanded U-boats in the First World War. He had been there when the potential of unrestricted submarine warfare was first glimpsed, and had spent the interwar years obsessively refining his theories, writing manuals, and training a cadre of elite officers in his vision. While the Nazi war machine sprawled across the European continent, Dönitz's vision remained unwaveringly focused on the grey, storm-tossed expanse of the Atlantic. He understood, with a clarity that eluded many of his contemporaries in the Wehrmacht High Command, including the surface fleet-obsessed Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, that the war would not be won by territorial conquest alone, but by the ruthless, systematic strangulation of Great Britain's oceanic lifelines. His entire philosophy was encapsulated in the term Tonnagekrieg, the tonnage war. The goal was not merely to sink ships in dramatic battles, but to sink them faster than the Allies could build them, to drain the economic lifeblood of the empire in a war of industrial and logistical attrition. It was a cold, mathematical approach to warfare. In the early years of the conflict, his U-boats had reaped a terrible harvest, operating in coordinated wolf packs, the famed Rudel tactic, to savage convoys in the mid-Atlantic gap, beyond the reach of land-based air cover. Using a central control station in Lorient, Dönitz, the Lion, would sit for hours, poring over situation maps, vectoring his dispersed packs onto detected convoys, orchestrating a series of devastating, coordinated nighttime surface attacks, where the U-boats' low silhouettes made them nearly invisible. But by late 1941, the situation was changing. The Allies were learning. Escort groups were growing in number and skill, equipped with better sonar, ASDIC, and primitive but improving radar. The cat-and-mouse game in the North Atlantic was growing costlier, the exchange rate less favorable. Then, in December 1941, the geopolitical landscape seismically shifted. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor plunged the United States, officially and irrevocably, into the global conflict. Hitler's initial reaction was one of disdain and racial arrogance, a fatal underestimation of the American industrial colossus, believing the nation to be weak, decadent, and racially divided, incapable of projecting its power across two oceans. Dönitz, however, a keen student of history and industrial capacity, perceived a fleeting golden opportunity in this disaster. He knew that American entry would eventually unleash an overwhelming tide of men and material, a wave of production that Germany could not hope to match. But he also knew, from intelligence reports and a profound understanding of the mechanics of mobilization, that this wave needed time to gather, to mobilize, to build, and to sail. The arsenal of democracy was not yet fully tooled. And in that narrow window of vulnerability, perhaps 6 to 9 months, he identified America's Achilles heel with the precision of a strategist. Its entire eastern seaboard, a sprawling, brightly lit, and psychologically unprepared coastline, a place he would later call the greatest strategic oversight of the entire war. American naval doctrine, forged in the late 19th century theories of Alfred Thayer Mahan, envisioned grand, decisive fleet actions between battleships. It was a doctrine of surface warfare, of Jutland-style clashes, completely unequipped for the furtive, brutal war of attrition waged by submarines against merchant shipping. The US Atlantic Fleet, commanded by the notoriously stubborn, difficult, and Anglophobic Admiral Ernest J. King, was a force in painful transition. Its most capable destroyers siphoned off to the Pacific, its remaining escorts often antiquated four-stackers from the Great War, its anti-submarine warfare tactics obsolete, and its commander's attention fatally divided by the overwhelming demands of a two-ocean war. Dönitz proposed an operation that was both bold and surgically precise, to dispatch a line of his long-range type mine submarines directly to the American coast, not to engage the Navy, but to slaughter the unguarded merchant fleet. The objective was simple, brutal, and psychologically profound: to unleash a massacre so swift, so devastating, and so shockingly close to home that it would shatter American civilian morale, cripple its coastal economy, and disrupt the flow of war material to Britain and Russia before the nation's industrial engine could even reach its first gear. The resistance within the German High Command was fierce and myopic. Many admirals, wedded to the prestige of the surface fleet and the romantic concept of a decisive naval battle, wanted the U-boats concentrated in the North Atlantic, defending against the Arctic convoys to Murmansk. They saw submarines as a defensive nuisance weapon. But Dönitz, with the tenacity of an apocalyptic prophet, argued that the greatest strategic and psychological impact would be to bring the war to America's doorstep. to make its citizens feel the hot breath of the conflict on their necks, to turn their vacation beaches into graveyards and their coastal waters into a maritime no man's land. After a tense and protracted debate, he secured authorization for a paltry initial force of just 5 boats from the larger Type 9 force. It was a gamble, a spear thrown into the dark across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, but it was a spear tipped with the finest steel, wielded by some of the most skilled, aggressive and ruthless commanders in the Kriegsmarine. Hardigan, the calculating marksman; Zapp, the efficient manager of death; Bleichrodt, the steady veteran; Kals, the night fighter; and Schuhart. It was a microscopic force to assign a continent-sized task, but Dönitz believed in the quality of his men and the sheer scale of the enemy's vulnerability. The Atlantic crossing of the U-123 was an odyssey of silent perils and profound isolation, a testament to human endurance and mechanical fortitude played out in a steel tube 251 feet long and just over 20 feet wide at its beam, a space that would become home, fortress, and potential tomb for 54 men for the next 2 months, submerged during the long, fearful daylight hours to avoid the prying eyes of Allied patrol planes. The boat became a claustrophobic world, a realm of perpetual twilight and artificial existence. The stench was a constant, oppressive assault on the senses, a smell you could almost taste. The pungent odor of 54 unwashed men living in the same clothes for weeks, the pervasive, oily reek of diesel fuel that seeped into every piece of food, every thread of clothing, and every lung, the sweet, sickly odor of rotting potatoes from the vegetable locker, and the acrid, ever-present chemical tang of the massive battery bank that powered the boat underwater. A smell reminiscent of chlorine that signaled the slow, insidious release of hydrogen gas, a silent, deadly hazard that could turn the boat into a floating bomb with a single spark. The atmosphere grew thick and foul. The oxygen depleted to levels that made men lightheaded, lazy, and short-tempered. The humidity, a constant 90–100%, clung to every cold surface like a cold sweat, condensing on pipes and control panels and dripping onto the men below, ensuring that nothing was ever dry. The crew existed in a state of sensory deprivation, their circadian rhythms shattered by the relentless, unnatural cycle of dive and surface. Their world was defined by the monotonous, whining hum of the seamen's Schuckert electric motors and the constant, gnawing anxiety of the hunt, the fear of the unseen depth charge, the sudden crash-dive alarm, the sound of a destroyer's propellers growing louder overhead. Each man was a cog in an intricate, deadly machine, his life dependent on the skill of every other. The chief engineer, a man with grease permanently etched under his fingernails and the weary eyes of a man who knew every groan and shudder of his mechanical charge, monitored the 2 mighty 9-cylinder Mayen diesel engines. On the surface, these roaring beasts could drive the boat at a brisk 18.2 knots, charging the massive battery banks and providing power for the long transits. Submerged, the silent, ghost-like electric motors provided a mere 7.3 knots, but they were the key to their stealth, allowing them to creep up on targets like a stalking panther or slip away from pursuers into the silent depths. In the sound room, a small, cramped space filled with dials and wires, the Hawk operators, with their high-quality headphones clamped tight, became the boat's ears. They listened to the vast, watery symphony of the ocean, the crackling of shrimp, the songs of whales. Their trained ears, some of the most valuable sensory organs on the boat, straining to pick out the faint rhythmic ping, ping, ping of an Allied Aztec set, the sound of death searching for them, or the distant, telltale thrum of a merchantman's screws, a sound they could classify by type and even estimate the ship's speed and tonnage. Up in the cramped, wind-lashed conning tower, exposed to the elements, Hardigan, his face stung by the freezing spray of the North Atlantic, navigated by sextant and dead reckoning. He was a lonely figure, a master chess player guiding his weapon through a featureless, hostile seascape, trusting his complex calculations against the fury of the unknown currents and the unpredictable North Atlantic weather. They were the hunters, but they were also the prey, perpetually balanced on a knife's edge. A single vigilant Sunderland or Catalina patrol plane spotting their wake, a fast-moving destroyer appearing as a mere smudge of smoke on the horizon, a single malfunction in the complex hydroplanes, or a small leak in the pressure hull. Any of these could send them plunging to a crushing dark grave on the ocean floor. It would be a steel tomb where the oxygen would slowly, agonizingly be replaced by carbon dioxide, and the final, desperate screams of men would be swallowed by the immense, silent, and uncaring pressure of the deep. The tension was a metallic taste in their mouths, as real as the hardtack and canned sausage that constituted their monotonous diet. But as the weeks bled into one another and the boat pushed past the 70th meridian west, a new kind of tension began to coil in their guts, a feeling of anticipation. The absolute, consuming darkness of the mid-Atlantic began to be subtly, then unmistakably, violated by a phenomenon none of them had seen in years of total war. It was a glow, a false dawn on the western horizon that no German submariner had witnessed since 1939. The lights of the American coastline, burning with what seemed like arrogant, reckless, peacetime impunity. Cities like New York, Atlantic City, and Miami painted the horizon with a brilliant golden smear, their collective illumination reflecting off the low-hanging clouds, creating a backlit screen that silhouetted their prey with perfect, almost theatrical clarity. For men who had operated for years in the pitch-black, rigorously blacked-out waters of Europe, it was a surreal, dreamlike vision of a world untouched by the grim realities of war, a world still dancing, driving, and living in bright, careless light, while the continent they had left behind was plunged into a survivalist darkness. For Hardigan and his crew, it was the ultimate tactical gift, a navigational aid, and a targeting system provided for free by the enemy's complacency. It was, as one crewman later wrote, like shooting at a black cat in a brightly lit hall. The American anti-submarine doctrine in that pivotal January of 1942 was, to be charitable, a catastrophic failure, a classic study in institutional blindness, inter-service rivalry, and a dangerous adherence to outdated theory. Admiral King, a man of immense pride, a deep-seated distrust of the British, whose advice on convoys he largely ignored, and a primary focus on the Pacific theatre, stubbornly refused to implement a coastal convoy system, the one measure that had been proven effective in the brutal, costly school of the North Atlantic. He cited a critical lack of escort vessels, a legitimate, but not insurmountable, problem, and clung to the outdated belief that fast, independent routing was the best defence for merchantmen, a theory that had been thoroughly discredited by the horrific losses of the British in 1940 and 1941. The result was a shooting gallery of epic proportions, a U-boat commander's dream. Merchant ships sailed alone, their profiles perfectly outlined against the city lights like targets in a carnival game. They maintained their running lights as if on a peacetime pleasure cruise, broadcast their positions, destinations, and even sensitive cargo manifests in uncoded, plain language radio transmissions, and followed predictable, well-charted routes just a few miles offshore, as if blissfully unaware that a new form of warfare had rendered their habits suicidal. The aerial patrols were sporadic, poorly organized and woefully inadequate, flown by a hodgepodge of obsolete aircraft like the slow PBY Catalina and even civilian light planes pressed into service, which lacked effective airborne radar and operated mostly in daylight, completely blind to the U-boats that operated with near-total impunity under the protective cloak of darkness. The US Navy was, in essence, fighting the last war, preparing for a surface battle that would never come, while a furtive, brutal campaign of attrition was devouring its merchant marine just off its beaches. The merchant captains, many of them veterans of peaceful trade routes, operated with a peacetime mentality, unable to conceive of a threat lurking just a few miles from their bustling, illuminated shores, naively believing the sheer vastness of the ocean would hide them. What appeared to be carefree confidence, a display of defiance towards an unseen enemy, was, in strategic terms, a vulnerability of historic and tragic proportions. And Reinhard Hardigan, his U-123, now a phantom lurking in the coastal waters like a wolf on the edge of a lit campground, was poised to exploit it with the cold, methodical precision of a master surgeon about to operate on an anesthetized patient. The night of January 18, 1942, some 30 miles south of Montauk Point, Long Island was crisp, clear, and unnervingly calm. The sea was a flat, black mirror, the sky a vast canopy of cold, hard, brilliant stars, their light undimmed by any terrestrial competition. The U-123 worms moved with a ghostly silence on the surface, its dark grey hull blending seamlessly into the inky water. Its diesel engines a low, steady rumble that was swallowed by the immense, primeval quiet of the night. Then, from the watch officer in the bridge, a hissed, electrifying word, that snapped everyone from their reverie to razor-sharp attention. Contact! There, etched in stark black silhouette against the golden, unwavering backdrop of the New York City skyglow, was the shape of a large, solitary ship moving at a leisurely, unconcerned pace, its running lights clearly visible. It was the SS Cyclops, a British-flagged freighter of 9,076 tons, laden with a cargo of iron ore, the very lifeblood of industry. Hardigan felt a familiar adrenaline surge, a cold, predatory focus settling over him. This was the moment they had crossed a hostile ocean for. He barked orders in a low, steady voice, and the boat came alive with a quiet, controlled frenzy, a well-rehearsed ballet of destruction. The U-123 maneuvered with practiced ease into a perfect attack position, its bow tubes facing the unsuspecting target's beam. The order to fire was given. The submarine shuddered with the distinctive, pressurized whoosh of a torpedo being ejected from its forward tube by a blast of compressed air. The G-70 Eel, a 3,000-pound, 23-foot-long cylinder of high-explosive Schieswoller 36, sped towards its target at 30 knots, leaving a faint bubbling wake of compressed air bubbles. On the bridge, every man held his breath, the only sound the lapping of waves against the hull. They counted the seconds, their heartbeats thudding in their ears in time with an imaginary stopwatch, their eyes fixed on the target. 1 minute, 2, and then nothing. Only the gentle lapping of the waves and the distant, unchanged silhouette of the Cyclops continuing its placid, oblivious journey. A dud, a miss, a profound, gut-wrenching failure. The first precious eel had been wasted, a testament to the notorious and persistent unreliability of the German magnetic influence pistols, which often failed to detonate when passing under a ship's magnetic field. But Hardigan, a veteran of the hard-fought, unforgiving North Atlantic run, did not fluster. He had seen this before. Failure was an intrinsic, expected part of the hunt. He immediately made a calculated, aggressive decision. "Gun action!" he commanded, his voice cutting through the disappointment. The U-123 closed the distance rapidly, its diesels now roaring openly, the element of stealth abandoned for brute force. At a range of just over 800 meters, the deck gun crew, who had been drilled relentlessly for this exact scenario, sprang into action. The 10.5cm SK-C-32 naval gun roared to life, its muzzle flash a brief, violent sunspot in the darkness, momentarily blinding the crew on the bridge. The first shell was a ranging shot, splashing into the water ahead of the freighter. Then, the next rounds, now adjusted, found their mark with devastating effect. The quiet night was torn apart by the staccato thunder of the cannon and the sharper, faster crack, crack, crack of the 20mm anti-aircraft guns, their fiery tracer rounds stitching brilliant, arcing lines directly towards the Cyclops' hull and superstructure. The freighter, unarmed and utterly defenseless, was systematically torn to pieces. It attempted to flee, its radio operator sending out a desperate, uncoded SOS. SSS, 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 submarine attacking. But it was a futile gesture in the empty, vast night. The high explosive shells ripped into its thin, unarmored hull, starting fires that quickly grew into an inferno, illuminating the ghastly scene in a flickering, hellish orange glow. Within minutes, the Cyclops, its back broken and its holds flooding with thousands of tons of cold Atlantic water, listed heavily to starboard and then slipped beneath the waves with a great hiss of steam, taking men and a vital cargo of iron ore down with it into the darkness. It was the first blood drawn by Operation Drumbeat in American home waters. It was not a battle between combatants. It was an execution, a stark and brutal announcement that the war had arrived, not with a formal declaration, but with a merciless, shocking ambush in America's front yard. The drumbeat had sounded, and its first note was one of fire and death. What followed in the days and weeks after that first kill was a period of unchecked, almost surreal carnage, a chapter of naval history the Germans would later refer to, with chilling and cynical aptness, as the second happy time, or more descriptively, the American shooting season. The 5 U-boats of Dönitz's initial wave, U-123 U-6, U-109, U-130, and U-502, unleashed a reign of terror that stretched from the frigid, fog-shrouded waters off Newfoundland to the warm turquoise currents of the Florida Strait. Hardigan's U-123 became the spectre of Torpedo Junction, the area off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where the warm, north-flowing Gulf Stream collided violently with the cold, south-flowing Labrador Current, creating treacherous, confused seas that were a perfect hunting ground, masking a U-boat's approach and complicating sonar detection for the few, inexperienced escorts that existed. On January 19th, just one day after the Cyclops, he found the Alan Jackson, a Panamanian-flagged tanker laden with 72,000 barrels of crude oil from Colombia. A single torpedo amidships was all it took. The tanker erupted in a cataclysmic fireball, a pillar of flame so intense it lit up the night sky for miles, a false sunrise of death visible from the shore. The sea itself caught fire, the spreading, volatile crude oil creating a hellish, burning moat around the dying ship. Most of the crew were incinerated instantly or drowned in the flaming water, their agonizing screams lost in the roar of the inferno. On January 22nd, it was the city of Atlanta, a coastal steamer whose terrified survivors in lifeboats watched in stunned, disbelieving horror as the U-boat, its snout-like bow and distinctive jumping horse emblem on the conning tower, clear in the moonlight, surfaced nearby. Expecting to be machine-gunned in the water, a common and often justified fear, they were instead approached cautiously. A young, polite, but utterly ruthless German officer, speaking clear English, gave them a bottle of rum, some bandages, and precise directions to the nearest land. This anachronistic chivalry, a bizarre holdover from a more gentlemanly age of warfare, would soon vanish as the conflict escalated in brutality and the Americans, stung and enraged, began fighting back in earnest. The rhythm of the kill became monotonous, almost routine, a grim factory of destruction. The U-boats would lie in wait on the surface after dark, their lookouts scanning the illuminated horizon. They would select their target from the endless parade of ships, maneuver into position with the confidence of a lion strolling through a herd of antelope, and strike with torpedo or the quicker, cheaper, and more psychologically terrifying gunfire. The success was so effortless, the targets so plentiful and naive, that the U-boat commanders' war diaries began to read like a butcher's ledger, filled with dry clinical notations of tonnage sunk. The human toll reduced to a mere numerical abstraction. Versenkt, sunk, was the most common word. In Washington, D.C., the reaction was a toxic cocktail of shock, disbelief, denial, and bureaucratic paralysis. The first reports of ships disappearing off the coast were met with official skepticism and even dismissal by the Navy Department, often attributed to marine accidents, mines laid by rumored Japanese submarines, or even internal sabotage. There was a profound unwillingness to accept that the Germans could operate so freely and so brazenly, so close to the American mainland. But as the number of SOS signals multiplied into a cacophony of distress, and the oil-slicked debris, splintered lifeboats, and bloated tar-covered bodies began washing up on the beaches of Virginia and the Carolinas, the horrifying, undeniable truth could no longer be suppressed. The war was not in some distant Pacific atoll or a muddy European field. It was here, in the sight of land, within swimming distance of American beaches, and the United States was losing, catastrophically and embarrassingly, in its own coastal waters. The public was about to find out. The initial American response was a textbook example of how not to fight a submarine war, a case study in institutional failure that is still analyzed in war colleges today. It was chaotic, disorganized, and tragically, fatally slow to adapt. Admiral King's stubborn refusal to institute a coastal convoy system, which he maintained for a cripplingly long 3.5 critical months, was his greatest and most costly failure in the Atlantic theater. His insistence on offensive patrols was a profound misreading of anti-submarine warfare fundamentals. His few available destroyers and Coast Guard cutters steamed along predictable, published routes, often miles away from the actual U-boat hunting grounds, like policemen walking a fixed beat in an empty alley while a rampant crime spree raged unchecked on the main street. Command was fragmented between 3 separate and often uncooperative naval districts: Northeast, Eastern, and Gulf Sea frontiers, with poor communication, little coordination, and no unified strategy, leading to a disjointed, patchwork, and utterly ineffective defense. The civilian government, under intense pressure from powerful tourism and business interests in coastal states, initially resisted imposing a full coastal blackout. Mayors of coastal cities from New Jersey to Florida argued passionately that darkening the boardwalks and beaches would cripple local economies and create widespread panic. The lights stayed on. The result of this collective failure of vision, leadership, and urgency was that Donitz's U-boats continued to operate in the most favorable conditions imaginable. a well-lit, target-rich environment full of slow, solitary and predictable ships, a U-boat paradise. The other U-boats joined the slaughter with grim, business-like efficiency. U-6, under Captain Lieutenant Richard Zapp, operated with deadly, mechanical precision off Florida and in the Caribbean, sinking tankers like the RP Resor, whose burning wreck was visible from the beaches of New Jersey for days, a constant smoky funeral pyre and a stark reminder of the nation's impotence. U-109, Heinrich Bleichrodt, and U-130, Ernst Kals, wreaked havoc in the shipping lanes off the Delaware Capes and in the deep water passages of the Caribbean, turning tropical paradise into a maritime graveyard. The tonnage figures climbed at an astronomical, unsustainable rate. In January and February of 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 80 ships off the US East Coast, totaling nearly 500,000 tons. The Germans were not just winning, they were administering a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, proving that a handful of determined men in a few well-handled boats could threaten the strategic mobility of an entire continent and bring the reality of total war to a nation that believed itself immune. The happy time was a period of such unparalleled, almost effortless success that it seemed almost unreal to the U-boat crews, who had grown accustomed to the bitter, hard-fought, and deadly battles of the North Atlantic convoys. Here off America it was not a fight. It was a harvest and the fields were ripe. The turning of the tide was not heralded by a single, dramatic naval battle like Jutland, but by a slow, painful, and often frustrating process of adaptation, driven by the sheer, shocking weight of material loss and the rising, furious public and political outcry. The war was no longer an abstract concept reported in newspapers. It was becoming a visceral domestic reality. The bodies of merchant sailors, often horribly burned, dismembered, or covered in viscous oil, began to wash ashore on the pristine, sandy beaches of exclusive resorts like Nag's Head and Palm Beach, a grotesque intrusion of war into the world of leisure, tangles of smouldering wreckage, splintered lifeboats, and life jackets blighted coastlines, fouling fishing nets and resort properties, the stench of death and oil carried on the sea breeze. The public, and more importantly, a scandalized and relentless press, began to refer to the situation not just as the Battle of the Atlantic, but with a more intimate, horrifying nickname born of shocking proximity: the Battle of the Piers. Newspaper headlines screamed in bold, accusatory type, "U-boats sink 28 in 4 days off Carolina coast," and "Why are our ships burning within sight of shore?" and "Navy asleep at the switch?" The political pressure on President Roosevelt and the Navy Department became immense, unbearable. Finally, in May of 1942, Admiral King, his hand forced by overwhelming public opinion, a furious Congress, and direct pressure from the White House, reluctantly authorized a partial limited system of coastal convoys, starting with the most critical route from Hampton Roads, Virginia, to Key West, Florida. It was the single most decisive countermeasure, the one the experienced British had been begging them to implement for months. The first of these, designated KS 500, sailed from Hampton Roads on May 14, 1942. The effect was immediate and dramatic, like turning off a tap. The loss rate of ships sailing in these protected, concentrated formations plummeted. The U-boats, which had feasted on solitary vessels for months, now found themselves facing compact, well-defended formations shepherded by a screen of destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, corvettes, and newly built subchasers. The easy hunting was over. The element of surprise and the overwhelming tactical advantage of the illuminated coastline were gone, but the Germans were nothing if not adaptable. Denied their rich hunting grounds off the American coast, they simply shifted their operations south, like a predator moving to a new territory, to the weakly defended Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, where the vital, slow-moving oil tankers from Lake Maracaibo and the refineries of Aruba and Curaçao provided fat, valuable targets. A second, though less intense and more contested, happy time blossomed in these southern waters, lasting through the summer of 1942, until the convoy systems were relentlessly extended there as well, slowly, systematically squeezing the U-boats out of their nearshore paradise and back into the deep water killing grounds of the mid-Atlantic, where the full might of Allied technology and tactics awaited them. While the surface battle evolved, a parallel and equally critical secret war was being fought in the realms of technology, intelligence, and intellect. A war of wits played out in quiet rooms that would ultimately prove more decisive than any single torpedo shot or depth charge attack. The U-boat's early dominance during Drumbeat was not solely due to American unpreparedness. It was also enabled by a critical, temporary failure in Allied intelligence. The British Code-Breaking Centre at Bletchley Park had, through a monumental intellectual effort involving the bomb machines and the genius of mathematicians like Alan Turing, cracked the German Enigma machine ciphers used by the Kriegsmarine, giving the Allies priceless, real-time insights into U-boat movements through intelligence known as Ultra. This was the Allies' most closely guarded secret, a weapon of incalculable value that had already saved countless tons of shipping. However, on February 1, 1942, just as Drumbeat was reaching its bloody, chaotic peak, the Kriegsmarine introduced a new, four-rotor Enigma machine, the M4, for its U-boat fleet, replacing the older three-rotor models. This new encryption system, with its vastly more complex cipher known as Triton to the Germans and Shark to the Allies, plunged the codebreakers at Bletchley Park into a 10-month period of darkness and frustration. For nearly a year, the most critical months of the U-boat offensive in American waters, the Allies were largely blind to the precise locations, intentions, and operational orders of the U-boat command. This intelligence blackout, a cryptographic disaster of the first order, coincided perfectly with the tactical and doctrinal chaos of Drumbeat, allowing Donitz's wolves to operate with a freedom, confidence and impunity they would never again enjoy. It was not until December 1942 that the brilliant, relentless minds at Bletchley, aided by captured codebooks from boarded U-boats like U-559 TARS and a round-the-clock effort, managed to break the Shark cipher, restoring the Allies' magic eye just in time for the climactic, decisive battles of 1943. But during the heyday of the Drumbeat offensive, the U-boats were true phantoms, their messages secure, their movements a terrifying mystery, their commanders operating with the confident swagger of the invisible man. Simultaneously, the Americans began a rapid, if belated, technological and doctrinal catch-up, a crash program fueled by national embarrassment and the nation's immense awakening industrial capacity. They started to implement the hard-won lessons and technologies that the British had already perfected through 2 years of bitter, costly experience. The introduction of the cavity magnetron, a revolutionary British invention which allowed for centimetric radar, was an absolute game-changer, a quantum leap in detection technology. Installed on both ships and aircraft, this new, high-frequency radar could detect a U-boat's conning tower or even its periscope on the surface, even on the darkest night or in thick, impenetrable fog, with a precision and at ranges that were previously unimaginable. Crucially, it operated on a wavelength that was initially completely undetectable by the German METOX radar warning receivers, which were tuned to the longer wavelengths of earlier Allied radar sets. The hunter had suddenly become the hunted, blithely unaware that an invisible, all-seeing electronic finger was pointing directly at them from a patrolling liberator in the sky, or from an escort on the horizon. The most feared weapon for a submariner quickly became not the destroyer, but the airplane, specifically the very long-range consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber. Equipped with this new centimetric radar, powerful Lee lights that could suddenly illuminate a U-boat on the surface like a stage actor caught in a spotlight, and a formidable load of depth charges, and the new forward-throwing Hedgehog spigot mortar, these aircraft could now patrol vast, previously unreachable areas of the ocean, finally, decisively closing the infamous mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had previously been safe from air attack and could operate with relative impunity. These aircraft were not just spotters. They were deadly, autonomous hunters, capable of finding and killing a U-boat entirely on their own. The formation of dedicated hunter-killer groups, built around small but fast and purpose-built escort carriers like the USS Bogue and Core, brought a new, aggressive level of offensive anti-submarine warfare to the Atlantic. These were not defensive convoy escorts. They were fast, flexible, and brutally proactive hunter packs that used decrypted ultra-intelligence, high-frequency direction finding, HFDF or HUFDUF, to rapidly triangulate U-boat radio transmissions, centimetric radar, and improved sonar to actively seek out, stalk, and destroy U-boats in their very own operational areas. The U-boat, once the master of the stealthy ambush, the phantom of the deep, was now being systematically tracked, hunted, cornered, and eradicated by a coordinated, technology-driven, multi-layered system specifically designed to negate its every historical advantage. The era of the U-boat as a war-winning weapon was coming to a violent, decisive end. The legacy of Operation Drumbeat is a complex and somber tapestry, woven with threads of tactical brilliance and ultimate strategic failure, a story of how a stunning, localized military victory can still fail catastrophically to achieve its grand strategic aims. From a purely tactical and operational standpoint, it was one of the most stunningly successful submarine campaigns in the entire history of naval warfare. In the first 6 months of 1942, primarily along the US eastern seaboard, the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, U-boats sank well over 600 ships, totaling more than 3.1 million tons, a figure that far exceeded the entire German naval staff's most optimistic pre-war projections and represented a staggering loss of vital cargo. The human cost was staggering and often overlooked. Thousands of Allied merchant seamen who displayed a quiet, unheralded, and essential courage that went largely unrecognized at the time, perished in the cold, burning, oil-choked waters, often within heartbreaking sight of the land they were trying to supply. They were the first and among the greatest casualties of America's direct involvement in the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats succeeded in paralyzing coastal shipping for a critical time, forcing a temporary but impactful rationing of gasoline and fuel oil on the East Coast, and instilling a deep-seated, tangible fear in the American populace. The image of a burning tanker on the horizon, its flames reflected in the water, visible from the beach, became an iconic and terrifying symbol of America's vulnerable, chaotic, and humiliating entry into the war. Yet strategically, Operation Drumbeat failed, and failed utterly in its primary war-winning objective. It did not break the American will to fight. It hardened it, forged it in fire. The initial shock, panic, and disbelief were replaced by a cold, determined, and unified fury. The attack, so close to home, so personal, served as a potent, daily reminder of the enemy's nature and the high existential stakes of the conflict, galvanizing public opinion for total war and silencing isolationist voices for good. Far from crippling the American war effort, it acted as a brutal, necessary, and ultimately self-defeating catalyst. The dormant American industrial giant, the arsenal of democracy, awoke with a roaring, explosive vengeance that dwarfed anything Dönitz or Hitler had ever anticipated. Shipyards like Henry J. Kaiser's Revolutionary, Richmond Yard churned out Liberty ships and, later, the faster Victory ships at a pace that defied all German understanding of production, ultimately building them significantly, faster than the U-boats could possibly sink them. The very mathematical definition of winning a tonnage krieg. The Battle of the Piers was, in the final, brutal analysis, a campaign that Germany could not win. It was a battle of production, of logistics, of national resolve, and of relentless technological innovation. And in all these arenas, the United States possessed an insurmountable, overwhelming advantage. Dönitz had successfully brought the war to America's shores, a masterful tactical stroke, but in doing so, he had awakened a sleeping industrial colossus that would now pour its unimaginable resources, ingenuity and rage into his and his U-boat arms, systematic and total destruction. What began with the solitary, fiery death of the Cyclops off the coast of Long Island ended with the inexorable, overwhelming tide of Allied industrial might and integrated anti-submarine technology. The U-boats that once ruled the American coastline with arrogant impunity were, themselves, systematically hunted to the brink of extinction in the carnage of Black May in 1943, a horrific, pivotal month that saw the loss of over 40 U-boats and the effective, permanent breaking of the back of the U-boat arm. Dönitz, his dreams of victory shattered, was forced to withdraw his decimated packs from the North Atlantic, his strategy in ruins, his best crews dead at the bottom of the ocean. Operation Drumbeat stands as a timeless, haunting case study, a stark and enduring reminder of how audacity, the ruthless exploitation of doctrinal weakness, and temporary technological superiority can inflict a devastating, shocking, and humiliating blow. But it is also a profound testament to the enduring power of resilience, the necessity of adaptation, and the sheer unstoppable force of mass industrial production married to scientific innovation. It was in those illuminated, deceptive coastal waters, in the twilight between a naive peace and a total war, that the United States received its most brutal and costly baptism by fire and learned its most enduring lesson of the Second World War, that no nation, no matter how powerful or geographically blessed, is an impregnable fortress. And that war, when it finally comes, does not always announce itself with a formal declaration or a glorious fleet action. Sometimes, it rises from the silent, dark depths, patient, relentless, and ravenous, to strike where you feel safest, in your own backyard. The echo of that first drumbeat roll off the American coast is a ghostly sound that still whispers a warning across the decades, a chilling note on the perpetual fragility of peace and the eternal, high price of preparedness, unwavering vigilance, and the willingness to adapt with ruthless speed when the old, comfortable ways of war have been rendered terrifyingly obsolete.